Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Good.
Good.
I want to start off with some sort of good news.
Sort of,
You
yeah.
know, somebody moved in our direction. I guess we can't say the philosophy has changed completely and totally, but the philosophy of many Texans has been heard. You know, Texas has been in the news a lot on this Dallas case, you know, which seemed to be so outrageous, and rightfully so. It got the attention it needed, even outside of Texas. But it maybe woke up some people in Texas, because what is going on here? You know, here we have this very conservative state, and yet we had regulations put on us as stringent as anybody else.
Yeah.
But finally, the people said enough is enough, especially after this lady that was running the Salon up in Dallas and being arrested, and all of a sudden the noise was out there. I mean, and what happened? But our governor changed his tune a bit. But it's all just routine, a little bit of mistake, and we shouldn't have arrested her and this sort of thing. So he's reissued his executive order on lockdown. And I would say that is good. You know, I always make the point that what really makes the world tick and what creates governments is ideological. And that's hard to believe, because sometimes you only have 10 people running the government, but there's an ideology behind it, and it's the tolerance or the intolerance of the people that make the difference. So numbers do count, and they're speaking out now. There are philosophies behind what they're doing, you know, the authoritarian approach and the ignorance on coronavirus and all these things. But all of a sudden, you know, the people spoke out, which is good. They're reflecting a position, and they say the right things. Do you think this could be constitutional? They're not. This isn't constitutional, is it? And it's certainly immoral. And you know what? I think the immorality of it is catching the attention of a lot of people. The lady that was in prison, what did it do? It prompted the Attorney General, was it, that to bail her out and pay her a fine and be willing to serve for her? This is pretty amazing. They're getting to the bottom of this when they talk this way. Of course, our goal in life is always to point out the flaws in the philosophy that's leading us in a certain direction, like economic policy, foreign policy problems. We don't want to wait until we have to fight to close the war down. We fought to try to prevent the Persian Gulf War and also the Iraq War, but look at how hard it is to close it down. So that's why a preemptive appeal for the right policy is much easier, but still, when they go wrong, when the people speak out, what we noticed here is the governor backed down, and we've heard from the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who I think is pretty solid on the issues. He said this act is shameful, and he's reflecting the people, and maybe this is a sign that things will change more radically in the right direction. But of course, they always remind us, don't get your hopes up, folks, because the world will never be the same again. If it isn't coronavirus, we'll have another virus to worry about. So we can never let our guard down. So I imagine our job in trying to promote what we do on this program to get people to understand, I guess we'll have that job for a while.
Yeah. Well, you know, the resistance to this growing tyranny from state to county to city, it needed a galvanizing event, really. And I think this was the galvanizing event. Shelley Luther up in Dallas, she said, you know what, I got to reopen my salon. I can't feed my kids. I'm a single mother. She said, forget it, I'm going to reopen it.
Perfect.
And she was called before the judge. And what did he say to her? You better get on your knees and apologize for insulting all of us wonderful law enforcement and judicial people. Admit that you're being selfish, or I'll throw you in jail. And she said, okay, throw me in jail, that's fine. That kind of bravery has made her, you know, a national symbol of this kind of resistance, the resistance of humble business owners. And actually, we have a tweet that we can put up. This is the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. He reacted. 7 days in jail, no bail, and a $7,000 fine is outrageous. No surprise Texans are responding. I'm covering the $7,000 fine she has to pay, and I volunteer to be placed under house arrest. so she can get to work and feed her kids. And that got out in front of the governor himself, who kind of said, oh, you know, this is really too bad. She shouldn't be jailed. Patrick came out and said, this is not right, and I'm going to cover it. And so what happened today is pretty interesting, and this is why we talk about in the title, Abbott capitulates. He's desperately trying to catch up with the way Texans are going as they wake up. And so he rushed out this morning and he said, I got to change my executive order. I got to make a new order. He said, throwing Texans in jail who've had their business shut down through no fault of their own is nonsensical, and I will not allow it to happen. That's why I'm modifying my executive orders to ensure confinement is not a punishment for violating an order. This order is retroactive and supersedes all other local orders. So order, I'm making new orders. Maybe the problem is making those orders in the first place.
That's right. You know, there was never anybody lobbying for all this stuff, all these regulations. They're lobbying now, and they're fighting for, and they're emphasizing getting rid of them, but they just came up. But nobody was begging for these things. They begged for safety and a few other things. But I find fascinating is that if you just thought about it traditionally, conservatives are law-abiding people. They're strong on law and order, and the Democrats are lackadaisical about it. But here, this brings the liberals into it when they see some of the atrocious things happening, you know, under this lockdown. Even though they say the national position of the liberals is that they're all for this lockdown. But I think there's sort of a split in that. I've said this on the program, that this is an opportunity, because I don't think that people suffering from this are all Republicans or all Democrats. People are suffering, and it's across the board. So if we could, what we want to do is try to unify people, because I argue always that the issue of liberty is very unifying. We may use our liberty differently, but we need to be unified on it, especially when it comes to this, when you get locked down. Conservatives and liberals get locked down, and people lose their livelihoods. We think of sometimes the far left as not people who have jobs, but they do have jobs, and they just have a different opinion. And all of a sudden they say, holy man, look at what is happening. And you know, the bailouts have sort of pasted this over a little bit, but that money doesn't last forever. That was sort of in weeks. So there's going to be a rebound, and I don't sit around worrying about the rebound of the virus, because that generally doesn't happen. But I see the rebound of the fear, because right now there's been temporary reprieve of this, and the stock market is reactive. Of course, that's why the Federal Reserve exists, is to keep the stock market propped up. So they've been able to do this. But the reprieve is coming, and I think that all of a sudden the people are going to say enough is enough, and I hope this brings the country together. Not so much people who argue, come together. Obey, obey, obey.
Yeah.
I say come together and resist. Yeah. It's the government that's messing you up, and I think there's a little bit of that sentiment coming about, you know, in the country, where you can see when you look at some of these rallies, it isn't like you know, the bankers and the businessmen are coming together to rebel, and it's not that. It's common people, and they look both conservative and liberal to me.
Yeah, and they're also of all colors and races and backgrounds, and that's what the media doesn't show either. But you talked about fear, and fear is important because fear has driven this whole thing. They terrified people, and the terrified supine people are willing to let government do anything. But here's what's interesting. Here's how they manage and regulate the fear. And I saw this headline on Zero Hedge, and there are a lot of other very fear-mongering publications as well. And it's new cases skyrocket of coronavirus despite opening up, you know, because of opening up the economy. But then you start thinking about it logically. Well, wasn't everyone screaming we need more testing, and states are racing to ramp up the testing, and so when you do a bunch more testing, you're going to find more coronavirus cases. So there's not a logical leap between doing more testing and more cases. It's just, oh my gosh, more cases. You know, and it's really interesting. But you talk about, you know, back to Texas for a second. It really is politics versus science, too, because they say, we've got to follow the science, But isn't it interesting, places like Harris County, places like San Antonio, everywhere where you kind of have liberals in charge, they are trying to resist and go even further than Abbott, who's seen as a conservative, who's seen as the other party, what have you, Democrats and Republicans. So it's really hard to ignore the politics that I think are really playing a key role here rather than the science.
You know, and politics gets a little bit confused at times, and I find it a little bit fascinating about what's going on between Virginia and Tennessee.
Yeah.
Isn't this interesting? You know, here they are on a border, and I guess there's a street that divides them, and Tennessee is a little bit more lenient than Virginia, because rural Virginia is ruled by the Virginians up near Washington, D.C., so they don't even care about the people down there. So you have one street doing quite well, and the restaurants that are open, and they're thriving. You have to look across the other street, and they're going bankrupt. They're not allowed to open. The difference there is so dramatic, and to think that the people who keep them closed down are actually doing anything. And you know, this whole idea, and we've talked about the testing for a long time, the reliability of the testing or non-testing and the interpretation of it and the lack of testing, it is so far removed from reality and deciding it. I think about it, and I wonder what things would have been like if nobody had done one single test.
Yeah.
You know, they probably wouldn't have worried about 100 different companies making a vaccine or closing down the use of one drug and trying to develop a new drug. There wouldn't be so much money involved and politics involved. People will see, Ron, you're crazy. What do you mean we couldn't have just gone along without finding out? Well, we used to do that. You know, we used to be able to do that, and we'd let medical people plod along. It wouldn't be dramatic. It wouldn't be politicized. It would cost a lot less money. And, you know, under those conditions, we, in many ways, conquered polio and smallpox. And in the old days, in medicine, it was private individuals working in a lab that made these discoveries. But no, that's removed. It's all politicized, and it's all medicine that has been politicized as well. So it's a real shame. But that incident in Virginia, do we happen to have anything to show?
We do have a picture of the street, actually, if we can look at the next clip, because it's pretty dramatic. You know, it shows Bristol, Virginia, and Tennessee on the other side. If we have that next clip, we can put up. But it is tragic. You know, this is downtown Bristol. And it's very, very sad, because it's an article we found in the Washington Examiner. On one side, there's a family that owns the burger bar. It's their family business. It's their livelihood. That's on the Virginia side, literally a few yards from the Tennessee side. The Tennessee side is open. The governor hasn't shut the place down. The Virginia side has no customers. And here's the owner of the burger bar. It's just not a very fair battle or fight. And I'm glad for the guys who get to open up, but I sure wish it was us, too. Tragic. They're able to do a little bit of takeout. He said he was lucky. He made between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m., he made $90, which is a tiny fraction. It's hugely packed. Everyone's having breakfast, eating burgers. And because of Governor Northam, who represents the elites in Northern Virginia and the tyranny against Southern Virginia, this guy just has to sit and watch as his business goes down the drain. You want to talk about that's the science? So the science says on this side of the street you're going to get corona, and on this side you'll be okay. Come on.
You know, I think this example points out how arbitrary it is.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a consistent society, even if you had different cities and towns and states, if they were consistent in defending the principles of liberty, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be this way. So they arbitrarily close down some people, but keep the people over that are essential. You know, and sometimes they're not essential. There's a lot more unessential people that should have been closed down. I think the non-essential people that we should really deal with are the politicians in Washington deciding who in America is essential and non-essential. But that was the case when they were closing down. What we're looking at here is the closing down of two different states differently. One state following some reasonable, rules and doing the job of looking more toward freedom. But the other side is arbitrarily, and then when they try to open up, it's the same way.
Yeah.
You can't open up everybody at once. They say that would be chaos. I say we have chaos now, and I don't know if I've used this example, but I'll use it again. Somebody told me once, it's sort of like arguing, slowly moving back into something. That's like somebody laying over top of you, beating the living daylights out of you, and you say, hold on, I want to move slowly. You quit gradually. And that's like arguing the economy. We should restore a free market gradually so we don't shake things up. Well, I think that I'm for opening. If things are wrong and they're harmful and they're violating basic principles and the real law of the land, I would say open up the doors the same way on foreign policy. We've been gradually reducing troops in the Middle East for a long time, but the wars continue, and we're still overseas in spite of our total bankruptcy. We don't cut anything from overseas in the military at all. I think we're up near the Arctic Circle right now trying to start a fight.
Well, the whole thing is about voluntarism. The other side is using force, telling you you've got to stay home. Voluntarism, if you don't want to go out, if you don't feel safe, stay home and don't go out. Stay home all you want. But they don't want that. They want to force the rest of us to stay home. But here's another thing, Dr. Paul. If you do stay home, guess what? It's no guarantee, because the big news out of New York and Governor Cuomo said, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is crazy. It turns out that the majority, 66% of the new COVID-19 diagnoses are from people who were strictly locked in their house, cowering in the darkness of their homes. He says, I can't figure out what's going on. Maybe they're not locked down tight enough.
Do you think that'll have an effect on the governor?
No.
I mean, there was a little effect on Abbott, because
Yeah.
I think he knew and understood what Texans are like, because when they make up their mind on something. But in New York, he probably won't have a change, and the likelihood of getting the people in downstate New York to change their mind isn't very good. So I guess they're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. But I do want to bring up another subject. And that has to do with, dealing with the meat shortage.
Yeah.
The artificially created meat shortage. So we've talked about it, and we had Thomas Massey on here, who knows something about it personally, because he's in the beef and farming business, and he has legislation proposed to try to figure this out. Why are we short of meat? Why can't we get meat to the market? And the analogy I use is, there's a fruit that can be ruined if it is not rapidly moved and taken to the customer.
Yeah.
That's bananas.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have a whole lot of bananas in the United States. We have to go to Guatemala. And even under these circumstances, you can go into the store and buy bananas, and they're in good shape.
Yeah.
But we can't get meat to the market. I mean, the meat is grown in Iowa and these different places,
Yeah.
but when you look into it, we find out that it had a lot to do with federal government regulations not allowing local people to sell their products. It's sort of like not being allowed to sell raw milk.
Exactly.
You get into trouble if they have a regulation against you.
It's all the government. There's a good article in Reason magazine that talks about Thomas Masseys Prime Act, which we've talked about quite a few times. But he points out in the article, which is interesting, because guess what? The whole problem was started by government regulation. He said this is all due to the reason why we can't, have small slaughterhouses serving local communities, all due to a law passed 50 years ago called the Wholesome Food Act that prohibits slaughterhouses from selling meat directly to the public unless they follow all the USDA's rules. So, these rules are, of course, all made to benefit the big slaughterhouses, the huge corporations, who it's not really a big cost for them to add all sorts of these things, whereas a small slaughterhouse, it's a huge cost. And so this is a problem that was caused 50 years ago. What Massey is doing with the Prime Act, if it passes, would address the shortages before they become critical. And it just says small slaughterhouses can sell meat directly to people within the state. So you can't export from Kentucky to Pennsylvania. You still have to do the USDA. So it's not super radical. But if you're slaughtering some beef in Kentucky, people from Kentucky can buy that beef without having the onerous USDA regulation. Simple.
See, I think a lot of what you just talked about is a result of a misinterpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. The way it's written invites, a distortion, but if you read about the writing of the Interstate Commerce Clause, they were trying to get a free market zone. They didn't want the prohibition that you could freely travel back and forth, and that you shouldn't be prohibited from selling your goods across the border. And this is what was intended, but they turned it around about 100 years ago or so and decided that was the excuse for them to regulate anything they want. And one thing that we've been fighting for in medicine is a little bit more freedom to sell medical insurance across state lines. But that's exactly opposite of what they want. They don't want the market to provide medical insurance. They want one payer system. So in a way, the Interstate Commerce Clause, if it were properly interpreted, would say that you should be able to buy goods and services, any place in the free market zone, which is the United States, and that wouldn't rule out, state prerogative. This is one place where, they said that they could do this. But I think that, unfortunately, we're going to have problems convincing people, of how to do this, because they'll say, we have to be safe, we have to be safe. But I'll tell you what, if people do get interested in that, they should follow up by letting their congressman know that they like what Thomas Massey is doing, and to support his legislation, the Prime Act.
And it's healthy. That's you bring in your local beef. You know how it's raised. People are worried about conditions in these mega farms. That would help. A lot of different fronts. But we're getting toward a closing, I guess. And I just wanted to circle back a little bit and talk a little bit about Dr. Stephen Shapiro. And I think we have a little quote that we can put up. But he is a University of Pennsylvania Medical Center's Chief Medical and Scientific Officer. And he was participating in a roundtable that Senator Pat Toomey put on, Republican from Pennsylvania, going over the lockdown. And this is a serious scientist, this is a serious doctor, and he's arguing that the lockdown is a disaster. And if we have that one clip, we can't read it all, but here's what he said. This is what happened in Pennsylvania in his university. Yes, we radically transformed our hospital to create a safe environment for patients and staff, delayed non-urgent surgery, this and that. And then here's what he said. We indeed saw a steady stream of patients, but it never surged. At peak mid-April, COVID-19 patients occupied 2% of our 5,500 hospital beds and used only 48 of our 750 ventilators. And even after that, subsequently, admissions have been decreasing. Now very few patients are coming. They have 0 positive cases in their facilities. This is what he says at the end. Our outcomes are similar to the state of Pennsylvania, where the median age of death from COVID-19 is 84 years old. The few younger patients who died all had significant pre-existing conditions. He concludes, in sum, this is a disease of the elderly, sick, and poor. His point being that those people can, as we've said so many times, be protected adequately, but locking down the rest of the society is a disaster. And Dr. Paul, I do want to finish on a positive note, though, because I like finishing on a positive note. If we can just put up that final clip. There are good guys out there. Here's the sheriff of Riverside County, California. He's under the rule of Gavin Newsom in California, who is a tyrant to beat all tyrants. And he said something simple. I am not going to allow my deputies, and I am not going to go into businesses, go into homes, and start hassling and harassing people. I refuse to make criminals out of business owners, single moms, and otherwise healthy individuals who are exercising their constitutional rights. Hats off to Sheriff Chad Bianco, Riverside County.
This is California.
California.
I'll tell you what, why wouldn't somebody hear this report? It's great that you have this report. Why wouldn't there be an uprising in California? Make him the governor. That's what we are. We're for him to become the governor of California. But they'd have to overcome a few bad people out there. But anyway, it's a great point. And that's the thing that the evidence is piling up. And Daniel was just talking about the lockdown. And it goes along with what he mentioned earlier, is that the people who did get locked down, they got sicker. And the people who don't get locked down do better, and they're getting better in spite of it. But the people that are likely to get it are the ones that have been mistreated. And this would be, in a way, solved by having more local people, individual people making personal decisions and making people be able to do things just voluntarily. Because when you have Dr. Fauci declaring a monopoly, control, and a dictatorship, and he has the money of Bill Gates, this is what you get. And people should have to wake up and say, enough is enough. We don't need to be told. We're capable of taking care of ourselves. Just get it out of the way. And that does not excuse people for being, dangerous. If you have it and people believe you're infectious, you ought to have the decency not to be out, but you have the decency not to associate with them. And if you're concerned about it, just don't go out. So there's so many ways that freedom can operate without saying, oh, you want to cause chaos. When people tell you that, say, yeah, sure, chaos like what you have. What do you have now? Is this called chaos? And in foreign policy, it's do it our way. And you could end up in a war, and they end up with a war, and they wonder why. And it all has to do with the basic philosophy of people's rights to do what they want if they don't hurt people. And there will always be problems, and that is what that is the job that all of us have, is to think it through and become as educated as possible to do the things that we think are in our best interest, in the interest of our families, but not in the interest of following the rules set up by Fauci. I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever. And someday we'll wake up and know that'll happen. History's going to prove that this is the biggest joke in the world. I think of when I went to the store the other day, but I got discouraged and left. I thought it was Halloween. And it refreshed my memory about my Halloween. And I remember the Halloween costumes weren't all that great when I was a kid. But boy, did I hate that mask. It made me feel, tied down, and I hated that thing. And when I saw that, I said, I got to get out of here. I've had enough of Halloween for this. And that's what I think society looks like. But anyway, I think we're making progress. And Daniel gave us some positive statistics. And, when I was out campaigning, when I talk about things that are honest and true, people should get worried about the economy and things. I said, but the one thing is, if you're engaged in the political activities at the time, you ought to have some fun, because nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Actually, things are getting better, maybe a little bit faster than I thought. So things aren't going to be always bad, and you only live for the moment. So we should have a little bit of fun. So find your allies. Have fun with them, and also get prepared. And I think first you have to get prepared is to be able to defend the principles of personal liberty and taking care of ourselves. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Please come back soon.